Introducing Rabbi Zeff at 10:06 on a Wednesday morning with Efrat Kollel as we zoom along with is it part four? Part four
Correct.
of Mashiach and messianism.
Okay. So nice to see everybody again. And as Bruce just told us, this is our fourth shiur. And believe it or not, there's going to be at least one more and possibly two more after this. It's a very big topic. And to explore something seriously, I mean, if we do it superficially and if it's passive, you just listen to what I have to say and we don't look at any primary sources, we could expedite the whole thing in half an hour. But that's not what learning Torah is about. It's to take a look at the primary sources and think about them and do a thorough job of it. So we've been exploring the issue of if somebody declares their candidacy to be Mashiach. Arthur puts his humility aside and says, I am the Mashiach. Is there a way to confirm that messianic claim? And we've been exploring particularly the approach of the Rambam. And we saw that the Rambam is basing this issue primarily on the precedent of an event in past Jewish history in which one of the greatest rabbis of all time, Rabbi Akiva, declared a contemporary of his, Bar Kokhba, to be the Mashiach. Well, upon what basis did Rabbi Akiva have the right to declare Bar Kokhba the Mashiach? And what's even more interesting about that is that in historical retrospect, when we look back, apparently Bar Kokhba was not the Mashiach. And considering that Rabbi Akiva was truly one of the greatest rabbis of all time, that the Gemara compares Rabbi Akiva in some ways to Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's indeed puzzling that Rabbi Akiva would make such a mistake. What's going on there? So the Rambam suggests that there are two fundamental ways of understanding what happened with Rabbi Akiva. Number one, what means are we not allowed to use in order to determine who the Mashiach is? A negative. And that is no miracles. That we don't ask the Mashiach to walk on water, Arthur, in order to prove that he's Mashiach.
That's because I can't swim.
So that would indeed be a miracle. Don't try it, please. So now, what does it have to do with Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva? Because when you look at the narrative of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, especially as presented in the Talmud Yerushalmi, there aren't overt miracles. Now, there are very impressive things that happen, but they all can be explained within the framework of nature. So that's number one. The Rambam says that you see the rabbis didn't ask him to do a miracle. As an aside, we saw that Rabbi Avram ben David, the Ravid, disagrees and points out in the Talmud Bavli, indeed, it has a story that the rabbis did ask him to prove they had supernatural powers, and when he couldn't prove that, the rabbis killed him. So there does seem to be a dispute based upon the narrative as appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi versus the narrative that appears in the Talmud Bavli as to whether or not you could ask the would-be Mashiach to do something supernatural to prove that he's Mashiach. In any case, we're following the Rambam right now. The next question we discussed is, well, what about the positive? We know we can't ask him to do. We can't ask him to perform a miracle. But is there, what positive means can we use to determine if the person is Mashiach? And here the Rambam has a very fascinating approach. He simply looks at the things that the Mashiach is supposed to accomplish based upon the writings in the prophets, and we'll call that the messianic agenda or the messianic to-do list. He says the following: 2 stages. If the would-be Messiah performs successfully a part of the messianic to-do list, so then he has the status of, as we saw last week, Cheskat Mashiach, under the working assumption of being Mashiach. We don't know for sure, but you could bet on it. Very impressive. If you're at the horse races, I would put money on that horse, as it were. And there are practical reasons why you want to know whether I make a presumption. Do I join his army? Do I volunteer to be an architect in the project of designing and building the Beit HaMikdash, rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, etc.? There's practical questions we have to resolve based upon a presumption of, I think this guy's very impressive. Maybe he's the Mashiach. Second step is, if he then accomplishes the entirety of the messianic to-do list, then you know for sure he's the Mashiach. And the Rambam lists specifically the ingathering of the exiles and the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash as kind of the, to use a Talmudic term, maka b'patish, the final hammer blow to bring absolute confidence and surety to the proposition that Arthur is Mashiach. We know for sure. Now, the truth of the matter is, if you think about it, it's a no-brainer. If a person accomplishes everything that the Mashiach is supposed to accomplish, then obviously he's the Mashiach, right? What's there to talk about? We could perhaps say that according to Rambam, the chidush, the novel suggestion, is that intermediary stage, and that is if he accomplishes part of the messianic to-do list, then he's under the presumption, cheskat Mashiach. That's an idea that the Rambam introduces as a chidush, as a novel idea. Now, what pushed the Rambam to say that? This is all a review, by the way. It's the fact that he's using, again, the paradigm of the relationship between Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. Let me, Bruce, you have a question?
Could there be a messianic
Okay,
dynasty?
hang on a second. So I just wanted to make sure it wasn't a technical issue, like you couldn't answer before. But I'll get your question in a second. Let me just finish the idea here. So he's using the precedent. How could Rabbi Akiva have declared Bar Kokhba to be Mashiach based on what? Number one. And number two, how could he have made a mistake? So with this construct of the Rambam, everything is clear. When Rabbi Akiva said Bar Kokhba Mashiach, he didn't mean he's Mashiach for sure. He meant very impressive. There's some form of religious revival. He fits the DNA of Mashiach Bar Kokhba. He's fighting the wars of the Lord against the Roman Empire, the superpower of the world, successfully. I'm willing to bet on him. I'm willing to bet on that horse. But the Bar Kokhba was not Mashiach for sure in the eyes of Rabbi Akiva. It was just a cheskat Mashiach. Now, of course, when Bar Kokhba was killed by the Romans without accomplishing the remainder of the messianic to-do list, right? There was not an ingathering of the exiles or rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash. Then even Rabbi Akiva knew that apparently Bar Kokhba was not the Mashiach. Maybe he could have been. I mean, maybe the generation wasn't worthy. And this is the theory of the Rambam to explain the relationship between Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. Works very, very well. Very creative and compelling theory of how to determine who the Mashiach is. Now, there's a little bit more in terms of the review, but maybe we'll just take us just a break for a second and for questions, and then we'll go back with the review and then go on with our little adventure here. Yes.
A mutual West Coast friend of ours is getting right here in the Geffen is getting a PhD in the idea of Bar Kokhba being part of a dynasty, and therefore I'm curious if the grandfather could die and the father, the son, if a family could accomplish this goal over several generations rather than just one person all at one time.
Yeah. Okay. So I was speculating right now. The way the Rambam describes this process, he certainly doesn't exclude the notion that there are leaders who contribute, not necessarily leaders, even just people, right? That there's a certain perhaps progress of the generations in terms of increasing levels of piety, of national pride, etc. But that's not called Mashiach. Mashiach is the leader under whose auspices we find the most significant steps.
Well, this is Bar Kokhba specifically, where the things were done by literally Bar Kokhba's family over 3 generations.
Yeah.
Right in the direction of...
So it's an interesting historical observation. I don't know, I haven't done the research myself in terms of the historical development, but the Rambam doesn't at all mention that notion. So I would just say the Rambam would certainly understand that there would be some other contributors to the process. But at the end of the day, there's going to be one person, and he is the king. And under his auspices, there are going to be major achievements or not. Okay, now, just to continue with the review before we go on.
Sorry,
Then
is there a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Is there anyone else besides the Rambam that has this construction or invention of a Cheskat Mashiach?
I don't think so. I'm not aware of it. I mean, that's a real chidush on the part of the Rambam. It's a novel suggestion. And it's very creative and it works. So I don't know of anybody else who makes such a suggestion.
So how do they answer the question on Rabbi Akiva?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hang on to that, because maybe we'll be able to, as we see what we're discussing in the continuation, it may help us understand a different way of approaching this.
Okay.
A little scary, as a matter of fact. Okay, now, the last thing we did last time was to examine the famous censored continuation of the Rambam's discussion. And as we pointed out last time, this last part of the Rambam is removed till this day from all standard traditional editions of the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. And the reason it was removed is because he says things that are incredibly offensive to Christianity and to Islam. And I actually think that there's actually something that's offensive to traditional Orthodox sensibilities as well, though I don't think that that's why it was removed. What am I talking about? So the Rambam goes on, he says the following. We just said that if the person doesn't complete the messianic agenda, then they're not the Mashiach. That's simple. And then he goes on to discuss, in contrast, Jesus, particularly. And he also mentions in sort of a passing way, Muhammad. And he says the following. Whereas, let's say Bar Kokhba could have been Mashiach, in the sense that he accomplished some of the messianic to-do list, but not all of it. And when he was killed, we know for a fact he's not the Mashiach. He was only the Cheskat Mashiach, under presumption, but he didn't get to the next stage. And maybe the generation wasn't worthy. And there have been other candidates, like Hizkiyahu and other people like that, perhaps could have been Mashiach, but ended up not being Mashiach. But then he contrasts that with another messianic claim, Jesus. It's not that Jesus is the failed Messiah, in the sense that Bar Kokhba was. That was an impressive personality, accomplished part of the messianic to-do list, but then didn't accomplish the whole thing, and perhaps we didn't deserve it. The Rambam claims that Jesus, in fact, accomplished, in quotes, the antithesis of the messianic to-do list. That is, all the things that Mashiach is supposed to accomplish, Jesus did the exact opposite through Christianity. I mean, you have to make, even the Rambam doesn't say it explicitly, but it's very clear from the way he describes things that a lot of the things that he's attributing to Jesus are really attributed to Christianity, but you have to give Jesus credit, as it were, according to the Rambam. So instead of being a religious revival, a return to the Torah is rejected and replaced by a New Testament. Instead of the rebuilding of the temple and a ingathering of the exiles, so we don't have rebuilding of the temple. And on the contrary, we have, under Roman domination, an accentuation of exile and greater persecution of the Jewish people. And on and on. All of the things that Mashiach was supposed to accomplish, Christianity, under the inspiration of Jesus, that's the presumption the Rambam makes, accomplished the inverse. And now, where the Rambam doesn't use this term, but I'm using it just because I think it's so apt. In the eyes of the Rambam, not only was Jesus not Christ, Christ just means Mashiach in Greek, it means the anointed one. So not only was Jesus not Christ, he was the Antichrist, right? So using a kind of Christian notion of Antichrist, but applying it somewhat facetiously to Jesus. I'm being facetious, but that is an accurate description of the Rambam's understanding of Jesus. He's not like Bar Kokhba, who is Cheskat Mashiach, but not Mashiach Bevadai, under presumption, but ultimately disproved to be Mashiach. He's the Antichrist. There's no even start to the discussion because he's not accomplishing anything. On the contrary, he's accomplishing the antithesis of the messianic to-do list. Fine. Now, so that part is the main reason why this text was censored, because that's pretty offensive to Christianity to say Jesus was the Antichrist. However, in Rambam's concluding sentences here, I think he's saying something which is a little wild from a traditional Orthodox point of view. And that is, he says that even though Jesus is the Antichrist through Christianity, Jesus, through Christianity, has actually contributed to the redemption of the world. So I like to say, again, it's my formulation, not the Rambam's, that Jesus, according to the Rambam, is the redemptive Antichrist. He's the redemptive Antichrist. So the Rambam says, how so? So first of all, he says that God has a wicked sense of humor. Again, that's my formulation, not the way the Rambam says it. The Rambam paraphrases the prophet Yeshayahu. Our thoughts are not his thoughts. Our ways are not his ways. God's wisdom and the way he runs history is inscrutable. And one of the inscrutable ways that he has run history, which we would never do it this way, is that before Judaism, the world was entirely pagan. And then the Jews come along. We're a tiny little people. But from us, as derivative of Judaism, there are these perversions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And through these distortions or perversions of Judaism, the fundamental notions of Judaism are spread throughout the entire world in a distorted form. And the Rambam's thesis, and you could argue with this thesis, and Daniel argued last week, or it was Arthur, I don't remember who did it, but the thesis was that it's easier to take a Christian or Muslim to the truth than a pagan to the truth. So God used the vehicles of Christianity and Islam in order to move humanity from paganism to a form of monotheism in which you have notions of commandments, of redemption, of a certain sacred attitude towards the Torah in complicated ways, etc. And then when the true Mashiach comes, who's going to be a master educator, he will be able to easily or more easily correct the distortions and move the world to the truth. I don't think the Rambam, by the way, means the truth means everybody becomes a Jew, but the truth in terms of these fundamental ideas and that the world would embrace the 7 Noahide laws. Okay, so I actually think that idea is a little offensive to certain traditionalist sensibilities. That's a pretty radical idea to say that Christianity is an abomination. So that part, a lot of Jews would have no problem with that. But then to say it's an abomination which is going to contribute to the redemption of the world, that's a leap. And that's a certain type of the ability to hold in your brain these two ideas, that it's both a distortion and worse. I use the word abomination. The Rambam has very strong feelings against Christianity. And at the same time, to say that in God's sense of humor, it's contributing to the redemption of the world, you have to be a big thinker to hold those two ideas in your mind at the same time.
That's not so far from Rav Kook, who talks about war being a process of moving the world forward towards redemption.
Yeah, Rav Kook had no problems holding these kind of dialectic of ideas that don't seem to easily coexist together. Rav Kook was a specialist in that. Okay, so that's up till now. Before we go on, I want to repeat something I said last time. That I want to use the models that we're developing to be able to explore the idea, is there any legitimacy to the notion of saying the Lubavitch Rebbe was or is Mashiach?
You talked about this.
Yeah, partially. Okay, but we're going to explore it more today. I just want to preface that by saying that I have the utmost respect for the most recent Lubavitcher Rebbe, one of truly my great spiritual heroes, and a person who's had a great impact upon me personally, not only in the past, but in the present. I learned Tanya and teach Tanya, and I consider myself in some ways a kind of unofficial Lubavitcher on some level. Okay, so I don't want my words today particularly to be misinterpreted as some type as reflecting some personal animus towards Chabad, which definitely does exist for certain people, but for sure not me. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that background. Okay, now we already pointed out that according to the Rambam, this is Daniel. This is what you were getting. This you were referring to before. We already said last week, based upon the Rambam's theory, I personally, at least, cannot understand how one could possibly use the Rambam's messianic theory to suggest that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the Mashiach. Right? According to the Rambam, and I see no other way of reading the Rambam, once a person dies, like Bar Kokhba, the Rambam says this explicitly. If the person doesn't accomplish the entire messianic to-do list, then they're not the Mashiach. It could be that the person was Bechezkat Mashiach, under presumption. So I suppose you could say, and again, you could argue with me, perhaps the contributions the Lubavitcher Rebbe made to the furtherance of the agenda of the Torah, perhaps you could argue merit that he is Chezkat Mashiach, but once he dies without accomplishing the other things on the list, like ingathering of the exiles, rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, etc., then he's not the Mashiach. We didn't deserve it. Period. Nothing more to say, according to the Rambam. But not so fast, Kowalski. So I want you to take out your second packet of sources that I distributed, which is called Dead Messiah, Mashiach Mina Meitim. We're going to take a look at some sources and use these sources to try to understand that maybe according to the Rambam, or at least to my mind, for sure according to the Rambam, Lubavitcher Rebbe is not the Mashiach. No way. He died. He didn't accomplish the messianic agenda. But let's take a look at this passage in the Talmud. We're going to read it, and there's some proof text. We're going to skip the proof text, the verses that are quoted. They're not important for our discussion today. Mashmo, the Talmud Masechet Sanhedrin asks, what's the name of Mashiach? Debei Rabbi Shilo Amre, the school of Rabbi Shila, say. So these are the students of Rabbi Shila. They say, you know what his name was? Shilo Shmo. And they quote a pasuk. Debei Rabbi Yanai Amre, the students of Rabbi Yanai say, no, his name is Yinon. Right? They're students from the school of Rabbi Yanai. Yinon and Yanai are the same name. Debei Rabbi Chanina Amar, the students of Rabbi Chanina say, Chanina Shmo. No, his name is Chanina, the name of their master. V'yesh omrim Menachem ben Chizkiah Shmo. Some people say, no, his name was Menachem ben Chizkiah. And it quotes a proof text. Okay, let's skip now to the concluding sentence here, which is the real punchline. Amar Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman said the following: I min chayahu, if he is from the living, kagon ana, then he's like me. Want to know who the Mashiach is? Well, if he's among the living, it's like me. You'll see in a second how ambiguous the formulation is and how confusing. And he quotes a proof text. Amar Rav, Rav answered in the same vein, Imin chayahu, if he's among the living, kagon Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Then he's like Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the editor of the Mishnah. Imin metayahu, if he's from the dead, Kagon Daniel ish chamudot. Then he's like the prophet Daniel, the precious man. Okay, now this, thank you for that, Arthur. For the thousands of people who will be watching this YouTube video, forgive Arthur, for he does not know what he does. So this is fascinating now. The Gemara just said, you want to know who the Mashiach is? And it said, if he's from the dead. Well, that's fascinating. This seems to suggest that there can be a Mashiach who's not alive, or at least not alive in the normal sense of the word. So if that's true, this opens up the intriguing possibility that somebody could be the Mashiach, though they're not alive in the normal sense of the word right now.
I have a question to ask you.
Sure.
We have only one Mashiach, and he's Eliyahu, and he's going to bring it. It's going to bring it to Israel when it's time to go to. How do we get the Rabbi or this guy? This guy. Where do we get this from? There's no Mashiach.
Well, so I'm not sure I understand the question. Where do we get what from?
No, we don't have a Mashiach. All we have is when Eliyahu comes, he's going to bring the Mashiach, or he's going to be the Mashiach, but not anybody else, the Rabbi or anybody, all the people that you mentioned.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't really 100% understand the question, but I would say the following. I mean, there is an idea of Mashiach that's mentioned Mashiach ben David, it's mentioned many times in the prophets and even alluded to in the Torah, as we saw in our first session. And the question is, who fits the bill? Now, you may be claiming that it's preposterous to claim that somebody who lived in New York could be the Mashiach. You would think that that's at least step one. They at least have to be a Jewish leader living in Eretz Israel. And so certainly the idea of suggesting that the Lubavitch Rebbe or anybody else who's not here and exercising leadership, maybe Netanyahu's Mashiach, right? But it's certainly not these other people. If that's what you're saying, so I hear what you're saying, but I just want to point out here that we do have an interesting Gemara that does seem to suggest that you could have somebody who's Mashiach but not alive. They were alive, but now they're dead, like Daniel. Okay, now I want to show you how complex this Gemara is. We're going to look at Rashi now. I just want to prime you for what's going to be the problem. There's a little word which appears in the Gemara here. We're going to focus on Rav's statement, right? If he's from the living, it's kagon. That's the word in the original Talmudic text. Kagon usually means, for example, or like. Okay? And the question is, how is that term being used here? And you'll see that Rashi suggests two different ways of understanding the word like. If he's from the living, it's like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. If he's from the dead, it's like Daniel. So you'll see how Rashi wrestles with this. So let's look in Rashi. So Rashi quotes Rav in the Gemara, if he's from the living, he's like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy master, the editor of the Mishnah. So Rashi says the following, Im Mashiach me'otan shechayim achshav. If the Mashiach is someone who's alive right now. So Rashi's saying when Rav says, if he's among the living, it's like Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rav and Rabbeinu HaKadosh lived at the same time. So according to Rashi's first explanation, if I want to know who Mashiach is, well, if he's alive, that rabbi over there, that's him. My spiritual master. Hang on, Bruce. Let's just get through this and then we'll open up for questions. So if he's among the living, Vadai Hainu Rabbeinu Kadosh. Then certainly, this is strong language. It's certainly Rabbi Yuna Nasi, Rabbeinu Kadosh, our holy master, the editor of the Mishnah. Why? The Sovel Tachluim v'Chasid Gamor Have, because he has the attributes of Mashiach. He has a tough life. He had physical illnesses, Rabbi Yunasi, and he's incredibly pious. He's incredible chassid. It doesn't mean a Lubavitcher. Chassid means pious, extremely pious, as explained in the Gemara. V'im haya me'otan shemetu kvar. If he is from among those who already died, haya Daniel ish chamudot. Then it was, the Mashiach was Daniel. Why? Shinidon b'Yisurim. He also had a very hard life. V'gova arayot, the Chasid Gamor haya. He also was extremely pious. So he had the suffering Messiah, right? That image is not made up by Christians. That's an authentic Jewish idea based on writings in the prophets. So if he's currently alive, right? So it's Rabbi Yonasi. If it's somebody who is dead, it was Daniel. Fine. Now let's read on, and then we'll open up for questions. We'll talk about it and open up for questions. V'hai kagon lav dafka. So when the Talmud uses the word like, kagon, it doesn't really mean like. Because like means that I want to know what the Mashiach will be like. What's a kind of prototype for the messianic personality? But Rashi says the first way of interpreting the Talmud is not in that sense. It means really who was Mashiach. So if you want to know who the Mashiach is, not like Mashiach, but is Rabbi Yuna Nasi. If you want to know who the Mashiach was, right, no longer alive, it was Daniel. Not like Daniel, but Daniel. Fine. But then Rashi says, Lishna Achrina. There's another way of interpreting the Gemara. And that's if you take the word kagon more literally, like. Then it changes the whole force of the Gemara. Kagon, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Then the Gemara would mean, if you want to know who the Mashiach is, it's someone who has the attributes of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbeinu Nasi. Klomar, im yesh dugmato b'chayim. If you can find somebody who is dugma, fits the pattern of attributes of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Hainu Rabbeinu HaKadosh, right? A person who has the attributes of suffering and piety. Well, those attributes, which are the messianic attributes, since Rabbeinu HaKadosh has those, well, maybe he's the Mashiach. Being dugma hu l'meitim. If you say that the messianic attributes, let's try to find somebody among the dead who might fit that and exemplifies the messianic attributes. That would be, for example, someone like Daniel Ish Chamudot. It doesn't mean he's the Mashiach. It wasn't the Mashiach. It means that he is the messianic prototype. So that seems to be what Rashi's saying, even though Rashi's language is a little confusing. But let me just review, and then we'll open it for questions. Two ways of understanding the Gemara, depending on how you understand the word like. If you say the word like doesn't mean like, then it's suggesting the following. If I want to know who the Mashiach is, if he's alive, it's Rabbi Yonah Nasi. If he's dead, it's Daniel. Second explanation, if you want to know a personality that represents the attributes of Messiah, not that he necessarily is, but he represents the prototype Messiah, well, if you're looking for an example of someone who embodies those attributes, among the dead, it's Daniel. Among the living, it's Rabbi Yonah Nasi. Those are very, very different explanations. Now, one more sentence and then we'll open up for questions. It seems to suggest that if you interpret it, that kagon doesn't mean for example, but it means really, then the Gemara is suggesting that Daniel was the Mashiach. Now, that raises a heck of a lot of questions. What does that mean to say that if you're looking for Messiah among the dead, oh, it's Daniel? What does that mean? He was Mashiach and he died. Where does that leave us? What does that mean? What does it mean to say he was Mashiach, but he died a long time ago? Does that mean we missed our chance? Mashiach, it's a mind-boggling idea. It's very hard to understand what that would mean. Does it mean that he came and it didn't work out, but he's Mashiach anyway, and it's all over? Or does it mean that he started the job, but maybe we'll finish it? Maybe he'll finish it when he comes back. Resurrection of the dead. He is Mashiach. Did the first part of to use the Rambam's theory, but not like the Rambam. He completed one half of the messianic to-do list, and when he comes back, he'll complete the rest. You could theoretically read that into Rashi's understanding of the Gemara. If you interpret the word kagon as not meaning, for example, but is. If you say it just means, for example, then it has no significance. It's just looking for a paradigm of the messianic personality. If you're looking for someone who's not alive, it's Daniel. If you're someone who's alive, then it's embodied by Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Okay, let's now pause here and take some questions, and then we'll go on. Bruce.
So since the Rambam believes that the Beit HaMikdash will be built, and Rashi believes it'll come down from Shemayim, has two different perspectives on something to do with Mashiach in terms of the Beit HaMikdash. Why would we use Rashi to help explain the Rambam when we can see he has a completely different worldview from the Rambam from the get-go? There should be we shouldn't use Rashi to understand the Rambam because it's different perspectives, question one. And question two is, could the word Mashiach have morphed over the centuries so it simply means something different today than it meant a couple thousand years ago?
Yeah. Okay. So there's two questions here. In regards to the first question, so I didn't mean to suggest, and I apologize if I was not clear. I'm not using Rashi to explain the Rambam. On the contrary, right? According to the Rambam, once you die without accomplishing the messianic to-do list, you're definitely not. I was just borrowing an idea from the Rambam that how he divides it up into two stages, right? So I'm taking that idea from the Rambam and applying it to Rashi. The Rambam wouldn't agree with that, presumably, right? I mean, not presumably, but I think it's impossible to suggest that. So in regards to the second question, could the word Mashiach mean something different, perhaps back in Talmudic times? It's possible. And I can see where you're going with that if you assume Mashiach doesn't necessarily mean in the kind of absolutist sense that we use it now. It's the savior of the Jewish people in an absolute sense, that there'll be no more exile after that. The world is fundamentally changed, etc. So, which way we usually use it now. So it's very hard to understand this Gemara. To say Daniel was the Mashiach, what does that mean? If you say, no, it means like a Jewish leader who's, he's anointed, he's a king, but it doesn't necessarily mean in sort of the absolutist sense.
And I thought that's how it was.
So, yeah, so it's certainly in biblical times where this idea originates, it meant any king was the Mashiach, was anointed. There's a term, Kohen HaMashiach. The Kohen is anointed. Right, so it didn't mean it in kind of the sense we use it now, but I would say that my guess is, and I haven't done the research, that when the Talmud uses that term like we're seeing now, I think it means it in the spooky sense of the word Mashiach.
Could that still be an older version of what it was really originally? Because even in Talmudic times, they're living under Roman oppression. They're crying out for a real bigger picture savior, and that might be
different. The problem is, I hear what you're saying. So what I'm suggesting is, it could have been at a certain point in Jewish history, Mashiach meant something less than we know. I don't think Rav meant it in that sense. The reason I'm saying that is because we have too many other sources, Talmudic sources, that talk about Mashiach in this spooky sense of the word, and so therefore it seems like by the time you get to the 2nd century of the Common Era, then already Mashiach means something more akin to the way we use the term now. Okay. So far, so good. Any other questions or comments before we go on? Because you'll see it's going to get complicated. Now, I think what I'm going to do is skip source number 3 and just paraphrase it. And that is, there's a famous story in the Talmud about a certain rabbi, and he meets Eliyahu. You know, Eliyahu kind of wanders around Jewish history and appears to people. And Eliyahu tells us, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that if you want to know when Mashiach is coming, why don't you just ask him? He's at the gates of Rome. It's a very famous Gemara. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi goes to Rome, and he has a conversation with this person. And says, when is Mashiach coming? You're Mashiach. I was sent to you by Eliyahu. And the guy says, today, except he didn't come. In the apocalyptic sense of Mashiach, right? And then the rabbi goes back to Eliyahu and says, this Mashiach, he lied to me. He said he's going to come today, and he didn't. So Eliyahu says, it's not that he lied, it's your fault. He would have come today, but you and the generation didn't deserve it. Okay, so I want you to just bear that story in mind as we now move on. Now, we're getting up to modern times now. I'm sure everybody's aware of, especially if you live in Israel, there's a tremendous amount of messianism associated with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. In Israel, I think it's because there's less hesitance to worry about what other people think or what the Gentiles will think. So in Israel, no problem having a huge billboard that instead of saying, Coca-Cola, it's the real thing, have a picture of Lubavitcher Rebbe and saying, Melech HaMashiach, or, Baruch haba, welcome Melech HaMashiach, etc. So, and it's in the United States too, but, I think slightly more subtle than it is in Israel.
Could Christianity have taken this idea from us, therefore, if this is an idea in the Gemara?
Okay, so that's a really good question, a super good question. In other words, if you talk to a lot of people and say, what's the big difference in Christianity and Judaism? A lot of people say, well, they accept Jesus as the Messiah and we don't, right? I actually feel that that's not the biggest difference, by the way, but that's a whole discussion which I don't want to get into right now. But that point itself, that Jesus could not be the Messiah, after all, he died and things weren't accomplished and the Mashiach was to accomplish. So there's this doctrine of the second coming. So most Jews would say that's ridiculous. That's just like a Band-Aid, that Christianity made up in order to be able to say Jesus is the Messiah, but he didn't accomplish the things supposed to accomplish. Oh, I got the answer. Here's a Band-Aid. I fixed the problem, right? Second coming. But as Bruce pointed out, it's not so simple that idea is unacceptable from a Jewish point of view. Because you just saw a Gemara that could be read to suggest that Daniel is the Mashiach. And that, now, Rashi doesn't say this, and the Gemara doesn't say this explicitly right now. We'll get more explicit in a minute. That I wasn't mean to say it was Mashiach, and is Mashiach. Well, because there's a second coming. So, but Bruce, and it's possible. By the way, as a footnote, one of my teachers when I was at Yeshiva University, I got a master's degree in Jewish history at Yeshiva University, so was David Berger. Some of you may have heard of him. So he wrote a book which is wholly devoted to attacking the notion that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is Mashiach. Now, I have also a lot of respect for Professor Berger. And something that's important to bear in mind, Professor Berger's real field are Christian-Jewish polemics in the Middle Ages. So Professor Berger has dedicated his entire academic life to studying Jewish-Christian polemics, which to a large extent from a Jewish point of view, are based upon the fact that you die without accomplishing the messianic to-do list, you ain't the Mashiach. Right? And so Jesus can't be the Messiah. So if you have a prominent Jewish movement that claims that, well, the Lubavitcher is Mashiach and he died, there's going to be a second coming. So from Professor Berger's point of view, this undermines the past 2,000 years of anti-Christian polemics, or proofs that Christianity cannot be the truth. That's a pretty scary proposition. So it's just important to sort of frame Professor Berger's response, even though it's a very compelling book and very passionately written and worth reading. Now, less known than Professor Berger's response to the contention the Lubavitcher Rebbe was and is Mashiach is a pamphlet that was published by Rabbi Menashe Klein. So let me just back up a little bit. Rabbi Menashe Klein, who died in 2011, was a Hasidic posek and Rebbe. He was the Ungver Rav. I'm not sure that's the right pronunciation. Something like that. He lived in New York. He was globally recognized and respected halachic decisor, posek. He wrote 18 volumes of halachic opinions, which are called Mishneh Halachot. Mishneh Halachot. And he wrote a whole booklet with a tremendous amount of passion, trying to respond to the contention with which he very strongly disagrees, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was and is the Mashiach. Now, you should also know, and you'll see it as we go on, Rabbi Menashe Klein, and you have to see a picture of him. I was actually thinking about doing a screen share to show you a picture, Rabbi Menashe Klein, but I didn't want to fool around with my computer. But, you know, this is not like your local Orthodox rabbi living in Efrat. You know, he looks like a Hasidic Rebbe. Right? This is not an attack from some liberal perspective or something like that, or rationalist perspective. This is a hardcore, you know, ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic personality who is very upset about the contention the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the Mashiach. But you'll see when we take a look at some of his material that he also very much respects the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
You see his picture, Rabbi?
Actually, I'm not sure that that's his picture. Are you sure that that's?
Yeah, that's him.
Okay, there we go. So that
I thought
does
this
not
was
look
Santa.
that does not look like your local Orthodox rabbi. I just want you. I think that's important to know where these words are coming from. Okay, so I just want to point out. You'll see later that it's very clear he also has great respect for the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Let's take a look now at source number 4. What I did was, I mean, it's a pamphlet. There's a lot of material there. I tried to select the most salient parts of the argument. So the first thing we're going to do is address this Gemara that we just learned, right? If the Mashiach, you know, has a list of the names of Mashiach, right? And then it discusses if he's from the dead, from the living, etc. And then you'll see he's going to bring in the story of the rabbi going to Rome to meet the Mashiach. Okay, and yeah, Arthur.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, further on in that same daf in Sanhedrin, it talks about an individual who suffers for Bnei Yisrael, and that sort of like ties in with the Christian view of he died for the sufferings and for the sins, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mentioned that actually before, that when Rashi says, why Daniel, why Rabbi Nasi? Like, why them? And as a matter of fact, Rabbi Nasi I could sort of understand. But Daniel, I don't get the impression that Daniel, like, when I take a look at Tanach, Daniel?
The leper in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi.
Yeah, you know, I'm not taking anything away from Daniel, just saying this. But you see that Rashi says, we need 2 qualities. He suffers and he's a Hasid, right? Hasid in the sense, the real word, right? Pious, not Hasidic, necessary. Could be. Okay. So And those are based upon psukim in the Nevi'im, right? Rashi didn't make that up. And again, just because Christianity says something doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. Right? They also revere the Tanach. And of course they use it in their own way and understand it in their own way. But the idea of that the Mashiach will suffer, so it's
sourced from us. It's sourced from Isaiah.
Exactly, it's from the writings of the prophets. I would say, and I don't want to get distracted, but the notion of his death atoning for the sins of humanity. So that's already not so simple to prove something like that. I
thought the suffering servant was Am Yisrael, not a person.
Okay, so it's possible, but that's part of the polemics, by the way. Okay, that's a way of undermining the Christian claim. Okay, let's take a look now. Source number 4. So Rabbi Menashe Klein says the following: Bechol dor yesh tzaddik echad. In every generation, there's one tzaddik. Haru'u liot Mashiach im yizku, who is in fact fit to be Mashiach if the generation will merit it. V'im lo yizku, and if they don't merit it, yet kisharet tzaddikim, then he's like any other tzaddik, which is pretty impressive in itself, below hefresh, without any distinction. He's just among the pantheon, as it were, of tzaddikim, but he's not Mashiach if the generation doesn't deserve him. U b'meit tzaddik Zeff yakum acher bimkomo. And now, when this tzaddik dies, and the generation didn't merit that he actualize his potential to be Mashiach, then in the next generation, another worthy candidate will arise. Sheyeh ra'ui lekach im yizku, that will be fit if the generation merits it. By the way, Bruce, there's a teacher after me?
Is there what?
Is there a teacher after me?
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, okay, so...
But I can tell him to...
No, it's okay. I think what I'm going to do... Let's just read it in English.
A few minutes.
Okay, I'm concerned about his time. I just want to read it. We'll do it in English just to expedite this, because he sort of takes a long time to make a fairly straightforward point. Okay? So what he's saying so far is, the Mashiach, every generation has a messianic candidate, not a fake. Someone who Arthur really could be, right? But it's dependent upon us. And if we don't deserve him, if we don't deserve Arthur, then the next generation will get another try. So every generation has a messianic candidate. So now let's just read in the English, the second paragraph. In this manner, they appraised in every generation who it may be. Therefore, after the destruction of the second temple, it was Menachem. And after him, it was Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yosef. In his generation, they said and knew that he was the one who was fit, but not necessarily Mashiach. He was the greatest candidate. And after his death, there was fit the one with whom Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi spoke at the gates of Rome, right? None of these people are Mashiach after they die. It's like the Rambam's theory, right? They could have been if we would have deserved it. And after him in the days of Rav Nachman, it was Rav Nachman. And so it is in every generation. There must be one who is fit if that generation deserves it. And if they don't merit it, he will die like the way of the world. And another person, not the same person, another person will arise in his place. And therefore, in our case, even if we were to say another tzaddik who is fit if we merit, after his death, there would be another tzaddik who is fit if we merit. Not that there will arise in the resurrection of the dead that tzaddik who had died, who had in the past been fit for the Mashiach. So he rejects totally the idea that that same person is Mashiach. The Gemara only meant Daniel was the Mashiach in the sense that he was the leading candidate. In that sense, was the Mashiach. He didn't actualize that potential. Why? Our fault. In the generation of Rav, who is that person? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Not like Rabbi Nasi. He is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He is the man. Will we press the actualization button? Depending upon us. That's how Rabbi Menashe Klein understands that Gemara. So based upon his understanding of the Gemara, the notion that the same person is going to come back at resurrection of the dead, the Gemara doesn't mention that. That's reading into it something which is not there. And therefore, there's no basis in that Gemara per se to justify the notion that the Lubavitch Rebbe was Mashiach and actually is Mashiach, and he's going to complete the job when he comes back in the resurrection of the dead. Okay, now you're going to see next week, not so fast, Kollel, that we do have a very distinguished, much more famous than Rabbi Menashe Klein, who is going to argue that no problem, you can have a person with Mashiach like Daniel, and he'll be resurrected and finish the job. Fascinating. We will see that source next week. Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi Zeff.
I was about to say, unless Mashiach comes in the interim, but presumably we'll be doing the same thing even after Mashiach comes. There's more of it. Okay, everybody. See you next week.